It was a dark and stormy Friday night when Jenny arrived for her first shift at the funeral home. The wind howled outside, shaking the old building to its very foundation. As she stepped through the door, she was hit by a wall of cold air that sent shivers down her spine. She had taken the job as a mortician's assistant to help pay her way through college, but she had no idea what she was in for. The funeral home was an ancient, eerie building on the outskirts of town, with creaky floors and drafty windows that rattled with each gust of wind. The air inside was thick with the smell of embalming fluid and musty, decayed flesh. The only light came from flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Jenny's boss, Mr. Johnson, was a gruff old man with a stern face and cold, soulless eyes that seemed to pierce through her very being. He showed her around the facility, pointing out the embalming room, the chapel, and the various storage areas for caskets and urns. "As you know, we provide services 24/7, Mr. Johnson said, his voice like an icy wind, which means that we sometimes have to work during the night. You'll be responsible for keeping an eye on the bodies, making sure they're properly refrigerated and prepared for viewing." Jenny nodded, trying to hide her unease. She had never been around dead bodies before, and the idea of being alone in a funeral home in the middle of the night was enough to make her skin crawl. She knew there was something deeply unsettling about the place, something that seemed to whisper to her from the shadows. As the night wore on, Jenny began to feel increasingly uneasy. She heard strange noises coming from the embalming room, like footsteps and whispers. When she went to investigate, she found nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched never left her. But the worst was yet to come. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share, before we continue. Around midnight, Jenny was putting away some tools in the embalming room when she heard a sound that froze her blood. It was a low, guttural groan, like someone or something was in terrible pain. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned around to face the source of the sound. To her horror, one of the bodies on the embalming table had risen, its eyes open and staring directly at her, its mouth agape in a silent scream. She could see that the skin was still pale and cold, and it seemed to be covered in a thick layer of frost. Jenny screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments. The body fell off the table and hit the floor with a sickening thud, but it didn't stop moving. It began to crawl towards her, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, its mouth moving in a silent, rictus grin. Jenny tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around her ankle and pull her to the ground. She turned around and saw the body standing over her, its eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light. She could see that it was no longer a mere corpse, but something far more sinister. Jenny tried to scream, but no sound came out. The body reached down and grabbed her by the hair, pulling her head back so it could look directly into her eyes. She could see that the flesh was peeling away from its face, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. And then it spoke. "Get out," it said, in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed underfoot. "Get out while you can." Jenny scrambled to her feet and ran out of the embalming room, not looking back. She could hear the body chasing after her, its feet dragging across the floor. She burst out of the funeral home and ran all the way home, tears streaming down her face. She never went back to that job again. Jenny was plagued by nightmares for weeks after her terrifying experience at the funeral home. She couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had attached itself to her, and that it was only a matter of time before it found her again. She tried to put the incident out of her mind, focusing on her studies and her social life. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the twisted, contorted faces of the dead, heard their haunting whispers in her ear. One night, while she was studying in the library, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned around and saw a figure standing behind her, its eyes glowing with a fierce intensity. It was the body from the funeral home. Jenny screamed and ran out of the library, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew then that she could never escape the horror that had been unleashed on her. Over the years, Jenny became increasingly isolated and paranoid. She was convinced that the dead were following her, watching her every move, waiting for their chance to strike. One day, she received a package in the mail. It contained a letter from Mr. Johnson, her old boss at the funeral home. In it, he explained that the funeral home had indeed been built on an ancient burial ground, and that the spirits of the dead had been disturbed by the embalming and cremation processes. He begged Jenny to come back to the funeral home and help him put the spirits to rest. She was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. As she walked through the doors of the funeral home, she was met by an unexpected sight. Mr. Johnson, her old boss, was standing in the center of the chapel. But there was something different about him. His skin was pale and translucent, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Welcome back, Jenny," he said in a hollow voice. "I'm sorry to have tricked you, but I had to." Jenny was frozen with fear. She realized that Mr. Johnson was not alive but was one of the restless spirits that haunted the funeral home. At this point, Jenny realized that she had made a mistake coming back to the funeral home, and wondered if she will ever get out of there alive this time.